Chapter 5. It was the Major's turn to entertain his friend, and by 9:30, on a certain squally October evening, he and Puffin were seated by the fire in the diary room, while the rain volleyed at the windows and occasional puffs of stinging smoke were driven down the chimney by the gale that squealed and buffeted around the house. Puffin, by way of keeping up the comedy of Roman roads, had brought a map of the district across from his house, but the more essential part of his equipment for this studious evening was a bottle of whisky. Originally, the host had provided whisky for himself and his guest at these pleasant chats, but there were undeniable objections to this plan, because the guest always proved unusually thirsty, which tempted his host to keep pace with him, while if they both drank at their own expense, the causes of economy and abstemiousness had a better chance. Also, while the Major took his drinks short and strong in a small tumbler, Puffin enriched his with lemons and sugar in a large one, so that nobody could really tell if equality as well as fraternity was realized. But if each brought his own bottle... It had been a trying day, and the Major was very lame. A drenching storm had come up during their golf, while they were far from the clubhouse, and Puffin, being 3 up, had very naturally refused to accede to his opponent's suggestion to call the match off. He was perfectly willing to be paid his half-crown and go home, but Major Flint, remembering that Puffin's game usually went to pieces if it rained, had rejected this proposal with the scorn that it deserved. There had been other disagreeable incidents as well. His driver, slippery from rain, had flown out of the Major's hands on the 12th tee, and had shot like a streamer of the northern morn, and landed in a pool of brackish water left by an unusually high tide. The ball had gone into another pool nearer the tee. The ground was greasy with moisture, and 3 holes further on, Puffin had fallen flat on his face instead of lashing his 5th shot home onto the green, as he had intended. They had given each other stymies, and each had holed his opponent's ball by mistake. They had wrangled over the correct procedure if you lay in a rabbit scrape or on the tram lines. The Major had lost a new ball. There was a mushroom on one of the greens between Puffin's ball and the hole. All these untoward incidents had come crowding in together, and from the Major's point of view, the worst of them all had been the collective incident that Puffin, so far from being put off by the rain, had, in spite of mushroom and falling down, played with a steadiness of which he was usually quite incapable. Consequently, Major Flint was lame, and his wound troubled him, while Puffin, in spite of his obvious reasons for complacency, was growing irritated with his companion's ill temper, and was half blinded by wood smoke. He wiped his streaming eyes. "You shall get your chimney swept," he observed. Major Flint had put his handkerchief over his face to keep the wood smoke out of his eyes. He blew it off with a loud, indignant puff. Indeed," he said. Puffin was rather taken aback by the violence of these interjections. They dripped with angry sarcasm. "Oh, well, no offence," he said. "A man," said the Major impersonally, "makes an offensive remark and says no offence. If your own fireside suits you better than mine, Captain Puffin, all I can say is that you're at liberty to enjoy it." This was all rather irregular. They had indulged in a good stiff breeze this afternoon, and it was too early to ruffle the calm again. Puffin plucked and proffered an olive branch. "There's your handkerchief," he said, picking it up. "Now let's have one of our comfortable talks. Hot glass of grog and a chat over the fire. That's the best thing after such a wetting as we got this afternoon. I'll take a slice of lemon, if you'd be so good as to give it me, and a lump of sugar." The Major got up and limped to his cupboard. It struck him precisely at that moment that Puffin scored considerably over lemons and sugar, because he was supplied with them gratis every other night, whereas he himself, when Puffin's guest, took nothing off his host but hot water. He determined to ask for some biscuits anyhow tomorrow. "I hardly know whether there's a lemon left," he grumbled. "I must lay in a store of lemons. As for sugar..." Puffin chose to disregard this suggestion. "Amusing incident the other day," he said brightly, "when Miss Mapp's cupboard door flew open. The old lady didn't like it. Don't suppose the poor of the parish will see much of that corned beef." The Major became dignified. "Pardon me," he said. When an esteemed friend like Miss Elizabeth tells me that certain provisions are destined for the poor of the parish, I take it that her statement is correct. I expect others of my friends, when they are in my presence, to do the same. I have the honour to give you a lemon, Captain Puffin, and a slice of sugar. I should say a lump of sugar. Pray make yourself comfortable. This dignified and lofty mood was often one of the after-effects of an unsuccessful game of golf. It generally yielded quite quickly to a little stimulant. Puffin filled his glass from the bottle and the kettle, while his friend put his handkerchief again over his face. "Well, I shall just have my grog before I turn in," he observed according to custom. "Aren't you going to join me, Major?" "Presently, sir," said the Major. Puffin knocked out the consumed cinders in his pipe against the edge of the fender. Major Flint apparently was waiting for this, for he withdrew his handkerchief and closely watched the process. A minute piece of ash fell from Puffin's pipe onto the hearth rug, and he jumped to his feet and removed it very carefully with the shovel. "I have your permission, I hope," he said witheringly. Certainly, said Puffin. "Now get your glass, Major. You'll feel better in a minute or two." Major Flint would have liked to have kept up this magnificent attitude, but the smell of Puffin's steaming glass beat dignity down, and after glaring at him, he limped back to the cupboard for his whisky bottle. He gave a lamentable cry when he beheld it. "But I got that bottle in only the day before yesterday," he shouted, "and there's hardly a drink left in it." "Well, you did yourself pretty well last night," said Puffin. "Those small glasses of yours, if frequently filled up, empty a bottle quicker than you seem to realize." Motives of policy prevented the Major from receiving this with the resentment that was proper to it, and his face cleared. He would get quits over these incessant lemons and lumps of sugar. "Well, you'll just have to let me borrow from you tonight," he said genially, and poured the rest of the contents of his bottle into the glass. "Ah, that's the ticket. A glass of whisky a day keeps the doctor away." The prospect of sponging on Puffin was most exhilarating, and he put his large slippered feet onto the fender. "Yes, indeed. That was a highly amusing incident about Miss Mapp's cupboard," he said. "And wasn't Mrs. Plasto down on her like a knife about it? Our fair friends, you know, have a pretty sharp eye for each other's little failings. They've no sooner finished one squabble than they begin another, the pert little fairies. They can't sit and enjoy themselves like two old cronies I could tell you of, and feel at peace with all the world." He finished his glass at a gulp, and seemed much surprised to find it empty. "I'll be borrowing a drop from you, old friend," he said. "Help yourself, Major," said Puffin, with a keen eye as to how much he took. "Very obliging of you. I feel as if I caught a bit of a chill this afternoon. My wound." "Be careful not to inflame it," said Puffin. "Thank you for the warning. It's this beastly climate that touches it up. A winter in England adds years onto a man's life unless he takes care of himself. Take care of yourself, old boy. Have some more sugar." Before long, the Major's hand was moving slowly and instinctively towards Puffin's whisky bottle again. "I reckon that big glass of yours, Puffin," he said, "holds between 3.5 times to 4 times what my little tumbler holds. Between 3.5 and 4, I should reckon. I may be wrong." "Reckoning the water in, I dare say you're not far out, Major," said he. "And according to my estimate, you mix your drink somewhere about 3.5 times to 4 stronger than I mix mine." "Oh, come," said the Major. 3.5 to 4 times, I should say," repeated Puffin. "You won't find I'm far out." He replenished his big tumbler, and instead of putting the bottle back on the table, absently deposited it on the floor on the other side of his chair. This second tumbler usually marked the most convivial period of the evening, for the first would have healed whatever unhappy discords had marred the harmony of the day, and, those being disposed of, they very contentedly talked through their hats about past prowesses, and took a rosy view of the youth and energy which still beat in their vigorous pulses. They would begin, perhaps, by extolling each other. Puffin, when informed that his friend would be 54 next birthday, flatly refused, without offence, to believe it, and indeed he was quite right in so doing, because the Major was in reality 56. In turn, Major Flint would say that his friend had the figure of a boy of 20, which caused Puffin presently to feel a little cramped, and to wander negligently in front of the big looking-glass between the windows, and find this compliment much easier to swallow than the Major's age. For the next half hour they would chiefly talk about themselves in a pleasant glow of self-satisfaction. Major Flint, looking at the various implements and trophies that adorned the room, would suggest putting a sporting challenge in the Times. "'Pon my word, Puffin," he would say, "I've half a mind to do it. Retired Major of His Majesty's Forces, the King, God bless him," and he took a substantial sip. "Retired Major, aged 54, challenges any gentleman of 50 years or over." 40, said Puffin sycophantically, as he thought over what he would say about himself when the old man had finished. "Well, we'll halve it. We'll say 45, to please you, Puffin. Let's see, where had I got to? Retired Major challenges any gentleman of 45 years or over to a shooting match in the morning, followed by half a dozen rounds with 4-ounce gloves, a game of golf, 18 holes, in the afternoon, and a billiard match of 200 up after tea. Ha! I shouldn't feel much anxiety as to the result." "My confounded leg," said Puffin. "But I know a retired captain from His Majesty's Merchant Service, the King, God bless him, aged 50. "Ho, 50 indeed," said the Major, thinking to himself that a dried-up little man like Puffin might be as old as an Egyptian mummy. Who can tell the age of a kipper? "Not a day less, Major. Retired captain, aged 50, who'll take on all comers of 42 and over at a steeplechase, round of golf, billiard match, hopping match, gymnastic competition, swinging Indian clubs. No objection, gentlemen?" Then carried Nem. Con. This gaseous mood, athletic, amatory, or otherwise, the amatory ones were the worst, usually faded slowly, like the light from the setting sun or an exhausted coal in the grate, about the end of Puffin's second tumbler, and the gentlemen after that were usually somnolent, but occasionally laid the foundation for some disagreement next day, which they were too sleepy to go into now. Major Flint, by this time, would have had some 5 small glasses of whisky, equivalent, as he bitterly observed, to 1 in pre-war days, and as he measured his next with extreme care and a slightly jerky movement, would announce it as being his nightcap, though you would have thought he had plenty of nightcaps on already. Puffin correspondingly took a thimbleful more, the thimble apparently belonging to some housewife of Anak, and after half an hour of sudden single snores and startings awake again, of pipes frequently lit and immediately going out, the guest, still perfectly capable of coherent speech and voluntary motion in the required direction, would stumble across the dark cobbles to his house, and doors would be very carefully closed, for fear of attracting the attention of the lady who at this period of the evening was usually known as Old Mappy. The two were perfectly well aware of the sympathetic interest that Old Mappy took in all that concerned them, and that she had an eye on their evening séances was evidenced by the frequency with which the corner of her blind in the window of her garden room was raised between, say, 9:30 and 11 at night. They had often watched with giggles the pencil of light that escaped, obscured at the lower end by the outline of Old Mappy's head, and occasionally drank to the Guardian Angel. Guardian Angel, in answer to direct inquiries, had been told by Major Benjy during the last month that he worked at his diaries on 3 nights in the week and went to bed early on the others, to the vast improvement of his mental grasp. "And on Sunday night, dear Major Benjy?" asked Old Mappy in the character of Guardian Angel. "I don't think you knew my beloved, my revered mother, Miss Elizabeth," said Major Benjy. "I spend Sunday evening as... well. The very next Sunday evening, Guardian Angel had heard the sound of singing. She could not catch the words, and only fragments of the tune, which reminded her of "The roseate morn hath passed away." Brimming with emotion, she sang it softly to herself as she undressed, and blamed herself very much for ever having thought that dear Major Benjy... She peeped out of her window when she had extinguished her light, but fortunately the singing had ceased. Tonight, however, the epoch of Puffin's second big tumbler was not accompanied by harmonious developments. Major Benjy was determined to make the most of this unique opportunity of drinking his friend's whisky, and whether Puffin put the bottle on the further side of him, or under his chair, or under the table, he came padding round in his slippers and standing near the ambush, while he tried to interest his friend in tales of love or tiger shooting so as to distract his attention. When he mistakenly thought he had done so, he hastily refilled his glass, taking unusually stiff doses for fear of not getting another opportunity, and altogether omitting to ask Puffin's leave for these maraudings. When this had happened 4 or 5 times, Puffin, acting on the instinct of the polar bear who eats her babies for fear that anybody else should eat them, surreptitiously poured the rest of his bottle into his glass and filled it up to the top with hot water, making a mixture of extraordinary power. Soon after this, Major Flint came rambling around the table again. He was not sure whether Puffin had put the bottle by his chair or behind the coal scuttle, and was quite ignorant of the fact that wherever it was empty. Amorous reminiscences tonight had been the accompaniment to Puffin's second tumbler. "Devilish fine woman she was," he said, "and that was the last that Benjamin Flint ever saw of her. She went up to the hills next morning." "But the last you saw of her just now was on the deck of the P&O at Bombay," objected Puffin. "Or did she go up to the hills on the deck of the P&O? Wonderful line." "No, sir," said Benjamin Flint. "That was Helen, La Belle Hélène. It was La Belle Hélène whom I saw off at the Apollo Bunder. I don't know if I told you. Oh, by gad, I've kicked the bottle over. No idea you'd put it there. Hope the cork's in." "No harm if it isn't," said Puffin, beginning on his third most fiery glass. The strength of it rather astonished him. "You don't mean to say it's empty?" asked Major Flint. "Why, just now there was close on a quarter of a bottle left." "As much as that?" asked Puffin. "Glad to hear it." "Not a drop less. You don't mean to say... Well, if you can drink that and can say hippopotamus afterwards, I should put that among your challenges. To men of 402. I should say 42. It's a fine thing to have a strong head, though if I drank what you've got in your glass, I should be tipsy, sir." Puffin laughed in his irritating falsetto manner. "Good thing it's in my glass, then, and not your glass," he said. "And let me tell you, Major, in case you don't know it, that when I've drunk every drop of this and sucked the lemon, you'll have had far more out of my bottle this evening than I have. My usual twice, and my usual nightcap, as you say, is what's my ration, and I've had no more than my ration, 8 bells." "And a pretty good ration you've got there," said the baffled Major, "without your usual twice." Puffin was beginning to be aware of that as he swallowed the fiery mixture, but nothing in the world would now have prevented his drinking every single drop of it. It was clear to him, among so much that was dim owing to the wood smoke, that the Major would miss a good many drives tomorrow morning. "And whose whiskey is it?" he said, gulping down the fiery stuff. "I know whose it's going to be," said the other. "And I know whose it is now," retorted Puffin. "And I know whose whiskey it is that's filled you up tight as a drum. Tight as a drum," he repeated very carefully. Major Flint was conscious of an unusual activity of brain, and, when he spoke, of a sort of congestion and entanglement of words. It pleased him to think that he had drunk so much of somebody else's whiskey, but he felt that he ought to be angry. "That's a very unmentionable sort of thing to say," he remarked. "And if it wasn't for the sacred claims of hospitality, I'd make you explain just what you mean by that, and make you eat your words. Apologize, in fact." Puffin finished his glass at a gulp and rose to his feet. "'Pologies be blowed," he said. "Hippopotamus." And were you addressing that to me?" asked Major Flint, with deadly calm. "Of course I was. Same animal as before. Pleasant old boy. And as for the lemon you lent me, well, I don't want it any more. Have a suck at it, old fellow. I don't want it any more." Major Flint turned purple in the face, made a course for the door like a knight's move at chess, a long step in one direction and a short one at right angles to the first, and opened it. The door thus served as an aperture from the room and a support to himself. He spoke no word of any sort or kind. His silence spoke for him, and in a far more dignified manner than he could have managed for himself. Captain Puffin stood for a moment wreathed in smiles, and fingering the slice of lemon, which he had meant playfully to throw at his friend. But but his smile faded, and by some sort of telepathic perception he realized how much more decorous it was to say, or better, to indicate, good night in a dignified manner than to throw lemons about. He walked in dots and dashes like a Morse code out of the room, bestowing a naval salute on the Major as he passed. The latter returned it with a military salute and a suppressed hiccup. Not a word passed. Then Captain Puffin found his hat and coat without much difficulty and marched out of the house, slamming the door behind him with a bang that echoed down the street and made Miss Mapp dream about a thunderstorm. He let himself into his own house and bent down before his expired fire, which he tried to blow into life again. This was unsuccessful, and he breathed in a quantity of wood ash. He sat down by his table and began to think things out. He told himself that he was not drunk at all, but that he had taken an unusual quantity of whisky, which seemed to produce much the same effect as intoxication. Allowing for that, he was conscious that he was extremely angry about something, and had a firm idea that the Major was very angry too. "But what's it all about?" he vainly asked himself. "What's it all been about?" He was roused from his puzzling over this unanswerable conundrum by the clink of the flap in his letterbox. Either this was the first post in the morning, in which case it was much later than he thought, and wonderfully dark still, or it was the last post at night, in which case it was much earlier than he thought. But whichever it was, a letter had been slipped into his box, and he brought it in. The gum on the envelope was still wet, which saved trouble in opening it. Inside was a half-sheet containing but a few words. This curt epistle ran as follows. "Sir, my seconds will wait on you in the course of tomorrow morning. Your faithful obedient servant, Benjamin Flint. Captain Puffin." Puffin felt as calm as a tropic night, and as courageous as a captain. Somewhere below his courage and his calm was an appalling sense of misgiving, that he successfully stifled. "Very proper," he said aloud. "Quite proper. Insults. Blood. Seconds won't have to wait a second. Better get a good sleep." He went up to his room, fell onto his bed, and instantly began to snore. It was still dark when he awoke, but the square of his window was visible against the blackness, and he concluded that though it was not morning yet, it was getting on for morning, which seemed a pity. As he turned over onto his side, his hand came in contact with his coat instead of a sheet, and he became aware that he had all his clothes on. Then, as with a crash of cymbals and the beating of a drum into his brain, the evidence of the evening before leaped into reality and significance. In a few hours now, arrangements would have been made for a deadly encounter. His anger was gone, his whisky was gone, and in particular his courage was gone. He expressed all this compendiously by moaning, "Oh, God!" He struggled into a sitting position and lit a match, at which he kindled his candle. He looked for his watch beside it, but it was not there. What could have happened? Then he remembered that it was in its accustomed place in his waistcoat pocket. A consultation of it, followed by holding it to his ear, only revealed the fact that it had stopped at 5:30. With the lucidity that was growing brighter in his brain, he concluded that this stoppage was due to the fact that he had not wound it up. It was after 5:30 then, but how much later only the lords of time knew, time which bordered so closely on eternity. He felt that he had no use whatever for eternity, but that he must not waste time. Just now, that was far more precious. From somewhere in the cosmic consciousness there came to him a thought, namely that the first train to London started at 6:30 in the morning. It was a slow train, but it got there, and in any case it went away from Tilling. He did not trouble to consider how that thought came to him. The important point was that it had come. Coupled with that was the knowledge that it was now an undiscoverable number of minutes after 5:30. There was a Gladstone bag under his bed. He had brought it back from the clubhouse only yesterday, after that game of golf which had been so full of disturbances and wet stockings, but which now wore the shimmering security of peaceful, tranquil days long past. How little, so he thought to himself, as he began swiftly storing shirts, ties, collars, and other useful things into his bag, had he appreciated the sweet amenities of life, its pleasant conversations and companionships, its topped drives and mushrooms and incalculable incidents. Now they wore a glamour and a preciousness that was bound up with life itself. He starved for more of them, not knowing, while they were his, how sweet they were. The house was not yet astir when, 10 minutes later, he came downstairs with his bag. He left on his sitting-room table, where it would catch the eye of his housemaid, a sheet of paper on which he wrote, "Called away." He shuddered as he traced the words. "Forward no letters. Will communicate." Somehow the telegraphic form seemed best to suit the urgency of the situation. Then, very quietly, he let himself out of his house. He could not help casting an apprehensive glance at the windows of his quondam friend and prospective murderer. To his horror, he observed that there was a light behind the blind of the Major's bedroom, and pictured him writing to his seconds. He wondered who the seconds were going to be, or polishing up his pistols. All the rumours and hints of the Major's duels and affairs of honour, which he had rather scorned before, not wholly believing them, poured like a red torrent into his mind, and he found that now he believed them with a passionate sincerity. Why had he ever attempted, and with such small success, to call this fire-eater a hippopotamus? The gale of the night before had abated, and thick chilly rain was falling from a sullen sky as he tiptoed down the hill. Once round the corner and out of sight of the duellist's house, he broke into a limping run, which was accelerated by the sound of an engine whistle from the station. It was mental suspense of the most agonizing kind not to know how long it was after his watch had stopped that he had awoke, and the sound of that whistle, followed by several short puffs of steam, might prove to be the 6:30 bearing away to London on business or pleasure, its secure and careless pilgrims. Splashing through puddles, lopsidedly weighted by his bag, with his mackintosh flapping against his legs, he gained the sanctuary of the waiting-room and booking office, which was lighted by a dim expiring lamp, and scrutinized the face of the murky clock. With a sob of relief, he saw that he was in time. He was, indeed, in exceptionally good time, for he had a quarter of an hour to wait. An anxious internal debate followed as to whether or not he should take a return ticket. Optimism, that is to say, the hope that he would return to Tilling in peace and safety before the 6 months for which the ticket was available, inclined him to the larger expense. But in these disquieting circumstances, it was difficult to be optimistic, and he purchased a first-class single, for on such a morning, and on such a journey, he must get what comfort he could from looking-glasses, padded seats, and coloured photographs of places of interest on the line. He formed no vision at all of the future. That was a dark well into which it was dangerous to peer. There was no bright speck in its unplumbable depths, unless Major Flint died suddenly without revealing the challenge he had sent last night, and the promptitude with which its recipient had disappeared rather than face his pistol. He could not frame any grouping of events which would make it possible for him to come back to Tilling again, for he would either have to fight, and this he was quite determined not to do, or be pointed at by the finger of scorn as the man who had refused to do so, and this was nearly as unthinkable as the other. Bitterly he blamed himself for having made a friend, and worse than that, an enemy, of one so obsolete and old-fashioned as to bring duelling into modern life. As far as he could be glad of anything, he was glad that he had taken a single, not a return ticket. He turned his eyes away from the blackness of the future and let his mind dwell on the hardly less murky past. Then, throwing up his hands, he buried his face in them with a hollow groan. By some miserable forgetfulness, he had left the challenge on his chimney-piece, where his housemaid would undoubtedly find and read it. That would explain his absence far better than the telegraphic instructions he had left on his table. There was no time to go back for it now, even if he could have faced the risk of being seen by the Major, and in an hour or two the whole story, via Withers, Janet, etc., would be all over Tilling. It was no use, then, thinking of the future nor of the past, and in order to anchor himself to the world at all, and preserve his sanity, he had to confine himself to the present. The minutes, long though each tarried, were slipping away, and provided his train was punctual, the passage of 5 more of these laggards would see him safe. The newsboy took down the shutters of his stall, a porter quenched the expiring lamp, and Puffin began to listen for the rumble of the approaching train. It stayed 3 minutes here. If up to time, it would be in before a couple more minutes had passed. There came from the station yard outside the sound of heavy footsteps running. Some early traveller like himself was afraid of missing the train. The door burst open, and streaming with rain and panting for breath, Major Flint stood at the entry. Puffin looked wildly round to see whether he could escape, still perhaps unobserved, onto the platform, but it was too late, for their eyes met. In that instant of abject terror, 2 things struck Puffin. One was that the Major looked at the open door behind him as if meditating retreat. The second, that he carried a Gladstone bag. Simultaneously Major Flint spoke, if indeed that reverberating thunder of scornful indignation can be called speech. "Ha! I guessed right, then," he roared. "I guessed, sir, that you might be meditating flight, and in fact, I came down to see whether you were running away. I was right. You are a coward, Captain Puffin. But relieve your mind, sir. Major Flint will not demean himself to fight with a coward." Puffin gave one long sigh of relief, and then, standing in front of his own Gladstone bag, in order to conceal it, burst into a cackling laugh. "Indeed," he said. "And why, Major, was it necessary for you to pack a Gladstone bag in order to stop me from running away? I'll tell you what has happened. You were running away, and you know it. I guessed you would. I came to stop you, you quaking runaway. Your wound troubled you, hey? Didn't want to bother, hey?" There was an awful pause, broken by the entry from behind the Major of the outside porter, panting under the weight of a large portmanteau. "You had to take your portmanteau too," observed Puffin witheringly, "in order to stop me. That's a curious way of stopping me. You're a coward, sir. But go home. You're safe enough. This will be a fine story for tea parties." Puffin turned on him in scorn, still concealing his own bag. Unfortunately, the flap of his coat caught it, precariously perched on the bench, and it bumped to the ground. "What's that?" said Major Flint. They stared at each other for a moment, and then, simultaneously, burst into peals of laughter. The train rumbled slowly into the station, but neither took the least notice of it, and only shook their heads and broke out again when the station-master urged them to take their seats. The only thing that had power to restore Captain Puffin to gravity was the difficulty of getting the money for his ticket refunded, while the departure of the train with his portmanteau in it did the same for the Major. The events of that night and morning, as may easily be imagined, soon supplied Tilling with one of the most remarkable conundrums that had ever been forced upon its notice. Puffin's housemaid, during his absence at the station, found and read not only the notice intended for her eyes, but the challenge which he had left on the chimney-piece. She conceived it to be her duty to take it down to Mrs. Gashley, his cook, and while they were putting the bloodiest construction on these inscriptions, their conference was interrupted by the return of Captain Puffin in the highest spirits, who, after a vain search for the challenge, was quite content, as its purport was no longer fraught with danger and death, to suppose that he had torn it up. Mrs. Gashley, therefore, after preparing breakfast at this unusually early hour, went across to the back door of the Major's house, with the challenge in her hand, to borrow a nutmeg grater, and gleaned the information that Mrs. Dominic's employer, for master he could not be called, had gone off in a great hurry to the station early that morning with a Gladstone bag and a portmanteau, the latter of which had been seen no more, though the Major had returned. So Mrs. Gashley produced the challenge, and having watched Miss Mapp off to the High Street at 10:30, Dominic and Gashley went together to her house to see if Withers could supply anything of importance, or if not, a nutmeg grater. They were forced to be content with the grater, but pored over the challenge with Withers, and she, having an errand to Diva's house, told Janet, who, without further ceremony, bounded upstairs to tell her mistress. Hardly had Diva heard than she plunged into the High Street, and with suitable additions told Miss Mapp, Evie, Irene, and the padre, under promise in each case of the strictest secrecy. 10 minutes later, Irene had asked the defenceless Mr. Hopkins, who was being Adam again, what he knew about it, and Evie, with her mouse-like gait that looked so rapid and was so deliberate, had the mortification of seeing Miss Mapp outdistance her and be admitted into the Poppet's house just as she came in view of the front door. She rightly conjectured that after the affair of the store cupboard in the garden room, there could be nothing of lesser importance than the duel which could take that lady through those abhorred portals. Finally, at 10 minutes past 11, Major Flint and Captain Puffin were seen by one or two fortunate people, the morning having cleared up, walking together to the tram, and without exception, everybody knew that they were on their way to fight their duel in some remote hollow of the sand dunes. Miss Mapp had gone straight home from her visit to the Poppets just about 11, and stationed herself in the window where she could keep an eye on the houses of the duellists. In her anxiety to outstrip Evie and be the first to tell the Poppets, she had not waited to hear that they had both come back, and knew only of the challenge and that they had gone to the station. She had already formed a glorious idea of her own as to what the history of the duel, past or future, was, and, intoxicated with emotion, had retired from the wordy fray to think about it, and, as already mentioned, to keep an eye on the two houses just below. Then there appeared in sight the padre, walking swiftly up the hill, and she had barely time under cover of the curtain to regain the table where her sweet chrysanthemums were pining for water, when Withers announced him. He wore a furrowed brow, and quite forgot to speak either Scotch or Elizabethan English. A few rapid words made it clear that they both had heard the main outlines. "A terrible situation," said the padre. "Duelling is direct contravention of all Christian principles, and, I believe, of the civil law. The discharge of a pistol in unskilful hands may lead to deplorable results, and Major Flint, so one has heard, is an experienced duellist. That, of course, makes it even more dangerous." It was at this identical moment that Major Flint came out of his house and quay-hied cheerily to Puffin. Miss Mapp and the padre, deep in these bloody possibilities, neither saw nor heard them. They passed together down the road and into the High Street, unconscious that their very look and action was being more commented on than the Epistle to the Hebrews. Inside the garden room, Miss Mapp sighed and bent her eyes on the chrysanthemums. "Quite terrible," she said, "and in our peaceful, tranquil Tilling." "Perhaps the duel has already taken place, and they've missed," said the padre. "They were both seen to return to their houses early this morning." "By whom?" asked Miss Mapp jealously. She had not heard that. "By Hopkins," said he. "Hopkins saw them both return." "I shouldn't trust that man too much," said Miss Mapp. "Hopkins may not be telling the truth. I have no great opinion of his moral standard." "Why is that?" This was no time to discuss the nudity of Hopkins, and Miss Mapp put the question aside. "That does not matter now, dear padre," she said. "I only wish I had thought the duel had taken place without accident. But Major Flint's portmanteau has not come back to his house. Of that I am sure. What if they have sent it away to some place where they are unknown, full of pistols and things?" "Possible, terribly possible," said the padre. "I wish I could see my duty clear. I should not hesitate to do the best I could to induce them to abandon this murderous project. And what do you imagine was the root of the quarrel?" "I couldn't say, I'm sure," said Miss Mapp. She bent her head over the chrysanthemums. "Your distracting sex," said he, with a moment's gallantry, "is usually the cause of quarrel. I've noticed that they both seem to admire Miss Irene very much." Miss Mapp raised her head and spoke with great animation. "Dear, quaint Irene, I'm sure, has nothing whatever to do with it," she said, with perfect truth. "Nothing whatever." There was no mistaking the sincerity of this, and the padre, Tillingite to the marrow, instantly concluded that Miss Mapp knew what or who was the cause of all this unique disturbance, and as she bent her head again over the chrysanthemums, and quite distinctly grew brick-red in the face, he felt that delicacy prevented his inquiring any further. "What are you going to do, dear padre?" she asked in a low voice, choking with emotion. "Whatever you decide will be wise and Christian. Oh, these violent men, such babies, too. The padre was bursting with curiosity, but since his delicacy forbade him to ask any of the questions which effervesced like sherbet round his tongue, he propounded another plan. "I think my duty is to go straight to the Major," he said, "who seems to be the principal in the affair, and tell him that I know all. And guess the rest," he added. "Nothing that I have said," declared Miss Mapp in great confusion, "must have anything to do with your guesses. Promise me that, Padre." This intimate and fruitful conversation was interrupted by the sound of 2 pairs of steps just outside, and before Withers had time to say, "Mrs. Plasto," Diva burst in. "They've both taken the 11:20 tram," she said, and sank into the nearest chair. "Together?" asked Miss Mapp, feeling a sudden chill of disappointment at the thought of a duel with pistols trailing off into one with golf clubs. "Yes, but that's a blind," panted Diva. "They were talking and laughing together. Sheer blind. Duel among the sand dunes." "Padre, it is your duty to stop it," said Miss Mapp faintly. "But if the pistols are in the portmanteau," he began. "What portmanteau?" screamed Diva, who hadn't heard about that. "Darling, I'll tell you presently," said Miss Mapp. "That was only a guess of mine, Padre, but there's no time to lose." "But there's no tram to catch," said the Padre. "It has gone by this time." "A taxi, then, Padre. Oh, lose no time." "Are you coming with me?" he said in a low voice. "Your presence—" "Better not," she said. "It might—" "Better not," she repeated. He skipped down the steps and was observed running down the street. "What about the portmanteau?" asked the greedy Diva. It was with strong misgivings that the Padre started on his Christian errand, and had not the sense of adventure spiced it, he would probably have returned to his sermon instead, which was Christian too. To begin with, there was the ruinous expense of taking a taxi out to the golf links, but by no other means could he hope to arrive in time to avert an encounter that might be fatal. It must be said to his credit that, though this was an errand distinctly due to his position as the spiritual head of Tilling, he rejected, as soon as it occurred to him, the idea of charging the hire of the taxi to church expenses, and as he whirled along the flat road across the marsh, the thing that chiefly buoyed up his drooping spirits and annealed his courage was the romantic nature of his mission. He no longer, thanks to what Miss Mapp had so clearly refrained from saying, had the slightest doubt that she, in some manner that scarcely needed conjecture, was the cause of the duel he was attempting to avert. For years it had been a matter of unwearied and confidential discussion as to whether and when she would marry either Major Flint or Captain Puffin, and it was superfluous to look for any other explanation. It was true that she, in popular parlance, was getting on, but so, too, and at exactly the same rate, were the representatives of the United Services, and the sooner that 2 out of the 3 of them got on permanently, the better. No doubt some crisis had arisen, and inflamed with love, he intended to confide all this to his wife on his return. On his return? The unspoken words made his heart sink. What if he never did return? For he was about to place himself in a position of no common danger. His plan was to drive past the clubhouse and then on foot, after discharging the taxi, to strike directly into the line of tumbled sand dunes, which, remote and undisturbed and full of large, convenient hollows, stretched along the coast above the flat beach. Any of these hollows, he knew, might prove to contain the duellists in the very act of firing, and over the rim of each he had to pop his unprotected head. He, if in time, would have to separate the combatants, and who knew whether in their very natural chagrin at being interrupted they might not turn their combined pistols on him first, and settle with each other afterwards. One murder the more made little difference to desperate men. Other shocks, less deadly but extremely unnerving, might await him. He might be too late, and pop his head over the edge of one of these craters, only to discover it full of bleeding, if not mangled bodies. Or there might be only one mangled body, and the other, unmangled, would pursue him through the sand dunes and offer him life at the price of silence. That, he painfully reflected, would be a very difficult decision to make. Luckily, Captain Puffin, if he proved to be the survivor, was lame. With drawn face and agonized prayers on his lips, he began a systematic search of the sand dunes. Often his nerve very nearly failed him, and he would sink panting among the prickly bents before he dared to peer into the hollow up the sides of which he had climbed. His ears shuddered at the anticipation of hearing from near at hand the report of pistols, and once a backfire from a motor passing along the road caused him to leap high in the air. The sides of these dunes were steep, and his shoes got so full of sand that from time to time, in spite of the urgency of his errand, he was forced to pause in order to empty them out. He stumbled in rabbit holes, he caught his foot and once his trousers in strands of barbed wire, the remnant of coast defences in the Great War. He crashed among potsherds and abandoned kettles, but with a thoroughness that did equal credit to his wind and his Christian spirit, he searched a mile of perilous dunes from end to end, and peered into every important hollow. 2 hours later, jaded and torn and streaming with perspiration, he came, in the vicinity of the clubhouse, to the end of his fruitless search. He staggered round the corner of it and came in view of the 18th green. 2 figures were occupying it, and one of these was in the act of putting. He missed. Then he saw who the 2 figures were. It was Captain Puffin, who had just missed his putt. It was Major Flint, who now expressed elated sympathy. "Bad luck, old boy," he said. "Well, a jolly good match, and we halve it. Why, there's the padre. Been for a walk? Join us in a round this afternoon, padre. Blow your sermon."